everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline from KnittingHouseSquare, and today I have another knitting tutorial for you. So in this video, I'm going to be keeping along with all of my flat knitting videos that I have, and today we're going to be knitting leg warmers flat. So what that means is that we're actually just going to be knitting one rectangle essentially, and then we're going to seam it up the side to create the tube shape. So what's great about this tutorial is first that it's very beginner friendly. So I'll show you every step you need along the way, cast on, how to knit, how to purl, how to switch in between different patterns. You can kind of tell how it alternates every 8 rows or so. I'll show you how to cast off, and I'll also teach you how to seam it up the back so that the seam becomes very invisible. So I'm not even sure, you can tell a little bit from the shadow where my seam is here, but it's pretty nice and hidden. Now, the other great thing about this tutorial is that it's fully customizable. So you're going to start off with your measurements, or I also provide resources of how you can get measurements, and you can create a leg warmer that'll fit you perfectly or whoever you're trying to knit this for. You can also customize the length. So you see here, and in my thumbnail of this video, I have one shorter version and then a longer version over here. So first, I'm going to give you an overview of everything I'm going to be showing in this video. Then we'll go through materials, the different calculations, and then next up, of course, the most exciting part, the knitting. Down in the description box below, you're going to find each one of the video breakpoints. That way, if you want to fast forward or rewind to any specific part of this video, all those timestamps are down below. And you're going to find the link to my website where you can find the full written version of this pattern. I hope you enjoy, and let's get started. The materials you're going to need for this project are going to be scissors, a tapestry needle, and I'll have links to some of these down below. Basically what it is it's a larger eye knitting needle, and it has a blunt tip on the side, so it's easy to weave in ends or do seaming with thicker yarn. It is helpful to have one of these bendy tape measures, especially if you are knitting your own leg. That way you can get a good accurate measurement. And then the knitting needles. This project is knit flat. So the nice thing about that is you can use really any type of knitting needle that you like, except double pointed. So first option, and what a lot of people will choose if they are beginner knitters, are straight knitting needles. So you're gonna wanna look for a US 7 straight knitting needle set, and they really can be any length. These ones are probably about 12 inches in length. Or if you'd like to, you can use a circular knitting needle and just knit flat. So essentially you would just hold one knitting needle on either side, and it gives you the exact same effect as using 2 straight knitting needles. So again, if you're going for the circular knitting needle option, you'd want US 7 knitting needles. And really any length cord. I like it to be a little bit longer just so it's easier to knit with. This one is probably about, I'd say 32 to 36 inches here. So US 7 knitting needles. Now the type of yarn you're going to want to use for this project is a worsted weight yarn. So to find a worsted weight yarn, you're either going to want to look for something that has the 4 symbol on it. So this would be an example here using the purple yarn. This 4 medium, that signals that it is a worsted weight yarn. Or you're going to want to look for a yarn that recommends a size US 8. So here you see the knitting needle symbol, and then above it, it says US 8. On the loop petal yarn that I'm using in this video, you can see that it doesn't specifically say worsted weight, but it does recommend a size 8 US knitting needle. So that's how I can tell it is worsted weight. The yardage that you're gonna need is gonna vary depending on the size of these that you're knitting, right? They're fully customizable. So it'll depend on the circumference and also the height that you knit them to. I have a whole portion of the video and also in the pattern link down below dedicated to estimating how much yarn you'll need. So I'll link to that video timestamp down below, and I'll also put the video timestamp up in the corner. The yarn that I'm specifically using in this video is from my local yarn shop here in Philadelphia. This yarn is called Loop Petal, and I have it in the peony colorway. Now, because these are fully customizable, we need some measurements to start off with. And I've provided two options. So the first is a great option if you're making these for yourself or someone that you know where you can easily get the measurements. Option 2 is a great method if you're gifting these to someone else. So I'm going to go through each one of these in detail real quick and what you need. First up, over on the left side of the screen, this isn't the option for if you can take your measurements. So you need to get two circumferences. First is A, which is the circumference around your calf, and then is B, which is the circumference around your ankle. So I have some pretend numbers that I used for my calculations here that we'll go through a quick example with. So my measurement for A was 14 inches, and then my measurement for B was 9.5 inches. And now what you need to do with those two is you want to calculate C, which is the average between them. So I'm just going to add up 14 and 9.5 and divide by 2 to get my C calculation. My C ends up being 11.75, which I need for a later part of the pattern to determine my number of stitches to cast on. Now, if you don't have the measurements available to you, you'll want to use the right side of the screen, which is using the resources that are available on my website. So those resources you can find average measurements for calf circumferences. And once you determine kind of the estimated calf circumference that you're going to need, you want to multiply that by 0.85. So for example, if I thought my estimated calf circumference was 14 inches, I multiply that by 0.85, and I end up with a C that I can use in later parts of the pattern of 11.9. Now, once you have that C number, either from measurements or the resources, we want to turn that number of inches into a number of stitches to cast on. So if I use the C that I previously got from my measurements, which was 11.75, I need to multiply that by 4.5 to get my number of stitches. So I'll have 11.75 times 4.5, and I end up with 52.875. Now that's a very uneven number, so what we want to do is we want to round the answer up to the nearest number divisible by 2. So I would round my answer up to 54 stitches. Last up, we're just going to call this number D. So my final answer is 54 stitches, and that is the number of stitches I'm going to use for my cast on. Lastly, I provide a resource for if you want to estimate the total number of yards you're going to need to knit the leg warmers you'd like. So you need two dimensions here. You need C, which we got either from our measurements or the resources. And then you need E, where E is actually going to be the height of the leg warmer that you'd like. So in my sample that I've shown, the pink one, my E measurement is 9.5 inches. Now to turn those 2-inch measurements into yards, I'm going to do C times E, so 11.5 times 9.5 are my numbers, and then I'm going to multiply that by 1.64, and I end up with an estimate of around 183 yards I would need to make both of the leg warmers. So again, this will make you a set of leg warmers, not just one. Okay, so to start, the first thing I need to do is make a slip knot. So I'm going to make a slip knot by unwinding a little bit of my ball of yarn here, and using my left hand, I'm going to put my left hand behind my strand of yarn. I have about 8 to 10 inches here in the front, and I'm going to grab onto that strand with my bottom 3 fingers in my left hand. Now next up, I need to wrap the yarn coming out of the ball around the pointer finger here. So I'm going to go back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, then back behind down to the bottom again, and grab onto that strand with my bottom 3 fingers as well. The way I make a slip knot is I rearrange these 2 loops. So I'm going to take the second loop and move it up closer to the tip of my finger, then take the new second loop, move it up closer to the top of my finger, and lastly, take the newest second loop, slide it off of my finger. When I do that, I've created a slip knot, and now at this point, you need your knitting needle. So I'm going to take one of my knitting needle points, going from the right over towards the left, and slide it right onto this loop. I have the tail or that end of the yarn closer to me, and I'm just gonna gently pull on that tail to tighten it onto my knitting needle. So that is our slip knot, and that slip knot does count as your first stitch. Now I need to cast on the next stitches. So I do find it's helpful to hold that yarn tail with my right hand as well, as I'm kind of holding onto the knitting needle here. I like to hold this stitch with my pointer finger as well, just to make sure it doesn't slide off. Now for the size I'm knitting, I need to cast on 54 stitches. And the way I want to continue casting on stitches is with what's called the backward loop cast on. The way the backward loop cast on works is it actually looks just like that slip knot we were just creating. So I'm going to take my left hand, put it behind the strand of yarn, wrap my bottom 3 fingers around the strand of yarn, and now I want to take my pointer finger and I'm going to wrap it around this strand. So I'm going to start off going down below, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top again. So now I essentially have like 1.5 loops around my pointer finger. So to make this an actual cast on stitch, I'm going to slide that loop off of my finger and onto my knitting needle. And you just gently tighten it onto your knitting needle. Now to make another stitch, I'm going to take my pointer finger back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, then slide the loop off of my pointer finger onto my knitting needle. Then I can go again, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, off of my pointer finger onto my knitting needle. If you ever accidentally drop the strand of yarn, right, or maybe you're trying to let go of it to count the number of stitches you have so far, all you want to do is again take your left hand behind the strand, grab onto it with your bottom 3 fingers, and now you're just going to loop it twice. You're going to go down below, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top again. And now you can start sliding the stitches and looping them. So I'm going to continue doing this until I've cast on the number of stitches I need. And for my size, that's going to be 54. Now that I've gone across and cast on all those stitches, I want to begin working my first row. So the way I begin working a first row is I'm actually going to turn my work. So instead of having my knitting needle point going over towards the left, I'm going to flip it so that knitting needle point is going over towards the right. And for this next step, you are going to want your second knitting needle now. So I would hold your free knitting needle in your right hand and your one with the stitches on it in your left hand. I also usually prefer to have my ball of yarn over towards the right. Now across this row, we're going to be alternating between knit stitches and purl stitches. So first stitch is going to be a knit stitch, and the way this has worked is you want to take your right knitting needle point and you want to go into the base of the first stitch on your left knitting needle, and you want to go into the base starting at the left and going towards the right, going from the front to the back, left to the right. So just like that. So if I look at this from different angles here, I'm taking my right knitting needle into the base. Now I want to wrap my yarn around, and when I wrap my yarn around, I'm going to go down below towards my left hand, then up across the top and pull it nice and snug in between those 2 knitting needles. Once I'm here, I'm going to gently pull on my right knitting needle, pull the loop through the stitch on my left knitting needle, then slide that stitch off of my left knitting needle. Now the next stitch I want to work is a purl stitch. So the first thing we have to do before we work a purl stitch is we have to bring our working yarn, or the yarn attached to the ball, to the front. The way you do this is you take your working yarn in your right hand and you bring it in between your 2 knitting needles to the front of your work. Once it's in the front of your work, now you're ready to actually move your knitting needles to create the purl stitch. A purl stitch is created by taking your right knitting needle point into the base of the next stitch on your left knitting needle. And when you go into the base of that stitch, you're going to the base of the front of it, going from right towards left. So it's almost like you start out in the back, you go towards the front, right to left. Now you want to wrap your yarn around, and when you wrap your yarn around, you're going to go up over the knitting needle, then down below, and pull it nice and snug. Now to create the actual stitch, you're going to take your right knitting needle point and you're going to push that loop through the stitch, then slide the stitch off of your left knitting needle. So that is now a purl stitch. And it's a little hard to see on this first one, but the purl stitches should create the bumps across your work. Now we need to go back to a knit stitch. So to go back to a knit stitch, I need to bring my working yarn to the back. So I'm going to go in between my two knitting needles to the back of my work. And now again, to show a knit stitch, the next stitch on your left knitting needle, you want to go into the base of it. You want to go from left over towards the right, front to back. I'm going to wrap my yarn around, going down below towards my left hand, then up over the top, pull it nice and snug, and then I want to slide that right knitting needle point so it catches that loop, pulls it through the stitch. I'm going to slide that stitch off of my left knitting needle. Next up I have the purl, so I need to bring my working yarn to the front, going into the base of the next stitch on my left knitting needle, going from back to front, right to left, wrap my working yarn up above, then down below. Then I'm gonna push that loop through the stitch, slide the stitch off. Back to a knit stitch, so I need to bring my working yarn to the back, go into the base of the next stitch, going from left to right, front to back, wrap the yarn down below towards my left hand, up over the top, pull it snug, pull the loop through, slide it off. Purl stitches next, bring my working yarn to the front, go into the base, back to front, right to left, wrap that working yarn up over the top, down below to the bottom, push that loop through, slide it off. So now I'll keep on doing a few more of these in slow motion without my narration on top. And now I'm just going to continue doing this knit one, purl one, all the way across all of the stitches I've cast on. Now that I've completed going across this first row, there's no more stitches over here on my left knitting needle, and all the stitches are over on my right knitting needle. So the next step is, again, I want to turn my work. So I'm going to turn my work, so my work with my knitting needle, or sorry, my knitting needle with my work on it is now pointed over towards the right. I'm holding it in my left hand, and now my free knitting needle, I'm holding in my right hand. Now for this next row, you actually want to repeat the exact same thing again. And you're going to end up repeating that first row that we just did a total of 8 more times, or 7 additional times since we already did 1. So the way you can tell that you're doing things correctly is you want to look at what the stitch below it looks like. So if the stitch below it has that bump on the front, you want to purl that stitch. If the stitch below it doesn't have the bump on the front, you want to knit that stitch. So it is the same pattern. It should be knit one. So going into the base of the first stitch from left to right, front to back, wrapping my yarn around, pulling it through. Then my next stitch is a purl stitch. So I'm going to bring my yarn to the front, go into the base from right to left, back to front, purl it. Right, and then keep on going all the way across, knit one, purl one, making sure they line up as you go across. And so this will be my second of 8 rows, and you want to do a total of 8 rows of this knit one, purl one ribbing. I just finished going across my 8th row, and now I'm gonna turn my work. And when I'm ready to begin working the next portion of the pattern, the way you can make sure that you did just complete 8 rows is once you've turned your work, your tail should now be over here on the left-hand side. And if you want to count your rows, the way you can do it is you want to ignore this bottom diagonal. Let me get the camera to focus on this real quick. And I'll use my other knitting needle to point. You want to ignore this bottommost diagonal, and then you just want to count the number of these V's that are going up. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then what's on the knitting needle. That actually counts as the 8th. So I've now worked 8 rows. What I want to do now is to get a little bit of a pattern where the stitches switch a little bit going upwards. Instead of working knit 1, purl 1 all the way across, I'm going to switch it to where I work purl 1, knit 1 all the way across. So to start off with a purl 1, the thing that I just make sure is I make sure that I'm taking my right knitting needle and I'm putting it behind my working yarn. That way you don't end up with a yarn over or anything like that at the beginning. So I'm going behind my working yarn, and now I go right into that first stitch purlwise. So going right to left, back to front, wrap my yarn around, pull through. And now I want to go to the back of my work with my working yarn and work a knit stitch. Another way you can make sure you're working the right stitch at the right time is you should essentially be doing opposite to what's below it. So this stitch right below it is flat, telling me that usually I would knit it. But I want to switch my pattern now, so I'm going to bring my yarn to the front and I'm going to purl that stitch. My next stitch has the bump in front, so usually I would purl it. I just purled one though, so I actually want to knit it. And I'm going to keep on working this purl 1, knit 1 all the way across. And if you look at that first row that we're creating, it does look a little funny at first. Essentially, it's because we're switching over from being knits to purls and we're switching each one of the stitches, so it creates little bumps across the row. Now I've completed going across that first row of purl 1, knit 1, and now I'm going to turn my work again. When I turn my work across this side, again, I'm going to work that exact same repeat. So I'm going to work purl 1, knit 1 all the way across. Now that I worked that first row though, each one of the stitches should line up with what's below it. So the first stitch here has a bump on the front, so I should purl it. Then the next stitch doesn't have a bump, knit it. Purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, and keep on going across. Now I want to work that row again a total of 8 times. And once I have worked that row a total of 8 times, I'll have worked up through the second portion. Now what do I do then? Once I'm at that point, I switch back over to the knit 1, purl 1, going all the way across. I work that a total of 8 times, then I switch back over to the purl 1, knit 1, work that 8 times. And that's all I'm doing over and over again to create this pattern. Of course, it'll all be typed out in the description box linked down below on my website. Now you do want to refer to the pattern as well for how far to knit yours. Because I was using worsted weight yarn, I ended up actually just continuing to knit until I had used up just below half of my ball of yarn. So I was able to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 repeats in before I cast off. So again, for the second one here, I'm going to work knit 1, purl 1, then purl 1, knit 1, right as my first repeat, then second repeat, over and over again, until I have a total of 7 of these blocks. Then I'll come back and I'll show you the cast off that I'm using. I just finished those 7 repeats and now I'm ready to cast off. And I do work the full number of repeat rows for the final repeat, and then I work the cast off. So it's kind of like there's an extra row on this one. Now in terms of how I'm going to cast off, I'm going to do a simple bind off where I work the stitches in pattern. So what I mean by that is instead of knitting every stitch and passing the previous stitch off, I'm gonna knit, then purl, then knit, then purl, and keep on working in the pattern as they are. What this looks like is I'm gonna knit the first stitch, or whatever pattern yours is. If you're starting with the purl stitch, start with the purl stitch. Then I'm gonna work the next stitch in pattern again, so I have the bump there, so mine's a purl. Again, yours could be a knit. And now to cast off, I'm gonna take my left knitting needle point, slide it underneath the stitch that's closer to my right hand. And now what I wanna do is I wanna slide this stitch up, over, and off. So I wanna leave this second stitch on my knitting needle, kind of like I'm wrapping this around that stitch. So I slide it closer to the edge, and then I pull it up, over, and off the second stitch. So I just cast off one. Now next I want to work the next stitch in pattern. So I'm going to move my yarn to where it needs to be. For me it's a knit. So I'm going to knit one. And now again I want to cast off. So I'm going to take the previous stitch, pick it up with my left knitting needle, and slide it off of the other stitch. Again, move my yarn to where it needs to be. Work the next stitch. Now take the previous stitch, slide it up, and you can kind of pull on it to make it larger as well, over and off. So I'm going to continue this all the way across this top edge. And you want to make sure you aren't pulling any of the stitches too tight too, because you want to make sure you still have plenty of stitch, or plenty of stretch along this edge. Now I have one stitch remaining here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull on the stitch to make it a little bit larger and just leave that sitting there for a second. Move my knitting needles to the side because I don't need those anymore. And now I wanna cut my yarn and I wanna leave a fairly long tail. So what I'd recommend doing is basically taking the size of your leg warmer as your measurement. So I bring it down, then up, and that way you have plenty of yarn to seam all the way along this edge. So I'm gonna cut it right there. And then I'm gonna thread this yarn tail through this remaining stitch. Just pull it nice and snug. That was our cast off edge. So now that we finished the knitting, what comes next is the seaming. So we wanna sew this together now. Now the final step is to do the seaming. So what I find is easiest is I usually leave my cast off tail to be a lot longer than my cast on tail. So I'm gonna seam with my cast off tail. I'm gonna put that edge of the fabric closest to me. And then I just wanna take each one of these edges and fold it in towards the center. That way it makes it a little bit easier for me to pick up one stitch from either side as I'm climbing up. I'm also gonna need a tapestry needle for this part. So I'm gonna thread my tapestry needle with the piece of yarn I'm gonna be using for the seaming. Now the type of stitch or the type of seaming we're gonna be doing here is called mattress stitch. And the way it works is on either side, you're gonna be looking for the bar that connects one stitch to the next stitch. So if you stretch out your work a bit, you can see that there are these horizontal bars connecting stitches. That's what we wanna pick up. Now they will look different depending on whether or not your edge stitch is a knit stitch or a purl stitch. So I'll show you exactly what you want to pick up as we go across. Starting over here on the right hand side, and it will kind of alternate back and forth. The pattern I finished here with was knit one, purl one, knit one. And the way I can tell is along this side edge, these all look like the nice V's where it is a knit stitch rather than the bumps for a purl stitch. So this, I want to pick up the bar in between this edge knit stitch and the purl stitch column. What I'm looking for, if I kind of stretch this out a bit, is within the purl stitch, you can see that there's kind of like a rainbow then a U shape, then a rainbow shape, right? So it's like a downward curve, an upward curve, a downward curve. I want to pick up this leftmost stitch right over here on this side. So it's like up, down, up. I want to pick up this first up. Now you want to start all the way at the bottom doing this. So I want to pick up the first of the up, down, ups and thread my yarn through. Now over on the other side, what do I want to pick up? So here I have the opposite at the end. So I actually finished with a purl stitch instead. And you can kind of tell because it's just a bit of bumps going down the side. So I had purl one, knit one, purl one over here. So if I stretch out my work, it's actually a little bit easier to see over here. You just want to stretch out that final purl stitch and keep that knit stitch column just as it is and find the bottommost bar on this side. Thread your yarn under it. Now you want to go back over to the opposite side and you want to move up one. So it goes up, down, up. You want to look for that first up. Go underneath it. Back over here on the other side, stretch out your work again and look for the next bar. And yours may look different depending if you started in this next section, which I'll show you in a moment. Gonna keep on going back and forth, and you'll notice I don't pull them tight yet. Actually wait a bit. So I'm probably gonna go through one of these full repeats first, and then I'll pull my yarn tight. Okay, so now I've made it through one of my repeats. So now I'm gonna hold on to my work and I'm gonna pull on this piece of yarn until it tightens up that whole bit that I just seamed. Now I'm gonna start again. So my pattern switched up here. So now essentially what I'm picking up just switch sides. So over here, I wanna unroll this a bit and I wanna pick up the bar right before this nice knit stitch column. The purl stitches like to roll over to the side. So I just want to pick up each one of these bars. See if I can stretch it out a little bit more for you. There we go. I have my purl stitch column over here on the side. So I want to pick up each one of these bars before this nice knit stitch column. On the opposite side, I have a knit stitch column. So I want to go over, and now I have my up, down, up. So I want to pick up now the rightmost up part, right? Up, down, up again. So I'd pick up the rightmost up part. Okay, so now that I've finished that repeat, again, I'm gonna hold my work and I'm gonna pull on the piece of yarn I've been seaming with, and it's gonna pull that nice and tight. So when I stretch out my work, you actually can barely tell where my seam is, I would say. You can tell a little bit from the edge down here, but everywhere else it really blends in nicely, and that's the goal of this mattress stitch, right? You're essentially taking one stitch from either side and tucking it into the inside. So then your ribbing pattern should match up perfectly. So just to show this last portion again real quick, and again, yours could be alternating differently than mine. I'm now back to a knit stitch on the column, then a purl stitch, then a knit stitch. So here, I'm looking for the up, down, up, and I want to pick up the leftmost up of each one of those purls. And then over here on the left-hand side, I have purl stitches along my edge. So I want to keep this column of knit stitches right here. And the way I do that is I stretch out. I just hold on to the very edge here and I stretch out my work a little bit. So these bars right down here next to that column of knit stitches are what I want to pick up as I'm seaming back and forth. So I'm going to continue going all the way up this edge. So now I just finished seaming all the way up, and you can maybe kind of tell where my seam is going along there. What I want to do now is I want to weave in these two ends. So I have my cast on and my cast off ends both here. And what I find is useful is first to turn it inside out. And there's different ways you can do this. Some people will tie a knot here and then weave in their ends. What I'm gonna do instead is I'm actually gonna start weaving in the ends a bit and then I'll tie my knot. So in order to hide them a bit and close up this little bit of a gap that can form at the beginning of a round, I'm gonna take this yarn tail that's over here on the right-hand side, and I'm gonna pick one of the stitches that are part of this seam that I just made over on the left and thread it under. Now I'm just gonna go up a few stitches, just wrapping the knitting needle underneath each one of the stitches as I go along. And now I'm gonna tie a knot. So I just pick up one of the stitches from, again, this seam that's going down the side. Gonna tie a knot. Oftentimes I'll actually do a double knot. So let's do that here. And then I'll just keep on weaving along the seam for another inch or two. When I'm all done, I stretch out my work just to make sure I didn't pull it tight or anything. And now I'm gonna cut that yarn tail. Now I want to do the exact same thing with my second yarn tail. So this one starts over here on the left, so I'm going to weave it in up the right side of this seam. Again, start off going a little ways. Now I'm going to tie a knot. And then keep on going up this right side. And once I've gone a little ways up, again, I'm gonna cut the extra yarn. Now the last step is first you wanna knit your second one. So once you've knit and seamed up your second one, you want to soak both of them in a bucket of lukewarm water. What that does is it helps to relax all the stitches and it'll make your seam lay a little bit flatter as well. So once they've soaked for about 15 minutes, roll them up in a towel to squeeze out any of the excess water and then lay them flat to dry. Once they're all dry, they'll be all ready to start using. Now I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Again, the full written version is available on my website. And if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date on all my new videos. I'll see you next time.